Welcome back to Intro to Christian History. We've been talking about most recently issues related to the Reformation. And in this class, we haven't had the opportunity to get into all of the reformers and all of the issues that I would like for us to get into, but we do what we can. And so we've talked a little about Luther and Zwingli and the Anabaptists and Calvin and the English Reformation, the Roman Catholic response to the Reformation and their own Reformation. And so now I sort of want to leave the time period that we would call the Reformation proper. And now that we've only got a few weeks left in the semester, for us to move along and to highlight some things moving beyond the Reformation. And I think one of the things that we need to think about and talk about, especially while we're still here in the 1500s and the 1600s, is to see some of the ways that Christianity began expanding into a more global faith rather than just the faith of Western Europe. So a couple of things that I want us to talk about here. But before getting into all of the expansion stuff, want to make sure that we understand a little bit of the time period that we're talking about, because as we've been talking about the Reformation, I think it's easy for us to think, oh, Reformation is this ideal period of time and theological things are going on and scriptures being translated and for those of us who may be staunchly Protestant, it's like, oh, finally truth has dawned and blah, blah, blah. And I think that's probably a little idealistic if that is your picture of this era, because it's not a terribly friendly time within the Protestant tradition nor the Roman Catholic tradition for that matter. So despite the theological things that are going on, ecclesial changes that are happening in terms of the life of the church and how we're doing the church and preaching and scripture and all those sorts of things, we've got to keep in mind that one of the results of the Reformation is a period of religious wars that rocked Western Europe. It was, in many ways, a devastating time in Western Europe. Not only do you still have plague and some of those sorts of things that are running around, you've got social upheaval, but now suddenly you've got territories that are trying to decide, are we going to go with the Reformation? Are we going to stay Roman Catholic? Catholics who don't like the Protestants and Protestants who don't like the Catholics, and we're all crammed into a relatively small area at points, and religious wars are one of the results of this. And it's sort of sad to say that for certainly more than 100 years, Christians, Protestant, and Christians, Catholic, fought each other to the death. I think the goal, the hope on both sides was to make advancements, and our side has the truth, and let's defeat the heretics on the other side and make advancements and win their territories, and that'll be beneficial for us. And the sad reality is that for all of the fighting that goes on, and for all of the hundreds of thousands of people who died during this time period, really not much changed. At the beginning, the territories that were Catholic were still Catholic at the end. Protestant territories, still largely Protestant at the end. So this is not a great time to be talking about things that are going on. It's hard, it's rough, and not a lot of developments happening in the church during this time in Western Europe, mainly because we're so busy fighting each other that, yeah, there's a few theological ideas that are expanding and getting out there, but for the most part, all of our attention is wrapped up in fighting one another. So, for example, we see the territories we would know today as Germany, German princes, fighting each other through the 1540s and 1550s, a series of wars, some of them still going on during Luther's time period. And we get to the end, and not much has changed. French Protestants were not a very big group, but they were decimated in 1572. Protestants and Catholics had sort of gone back and forth in terms of their leverage over the throne, and French Catholics sort of grabbed power, and mass killings were in effect on the Feast of St. Bartholomew. So St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre is what this event is called in 1572 in and around Paris, where we know that hundreds of Protestants were captured and killed by Catholics. Their homes were broken into. They were dragged out into the streets and beaten. They were killed in their beds. This was a terrible event and a terrible show of authority that the Catholics, as they were trying to reconvene their power in France at this particular time. And I guess in some way, the culmination of these religious wars was a series of wars called the 30 Years' War, which runs from the early to the mid part of the 1600s in Western Europe. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people were killed. Just about every nation in Western Europe was brought into the war to some degree, whether on the Protestant side or the Catholic side, and it was back and forth and lots of bloodshed. And when we finally establish the end of the war, called the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, basically nothing had changed. Tons of people had died for not very much, so it seemed. And I think that has an impact on Western Europe and how they think about the faith. Even to today, that there is a greater skepticism that emerges out of Western Europe, largely because so many of these wars were fought on their own soil. So many people died, that becomes a part of the story, and it becomes hard to shake for many people during this time and moving forward. I guess the other sort of, as we're thinking here about it not being a very friendly time, the other piece of this, at least in my mind, is when we get into the 1500s, we see increasingly nations competing against nations for new territories around the world. Really, if we go back to the late 1300s into the 1400s, some of the nations who are along the coast, who have access to waterways and seas and the ocean, are beginning to develop boat making and other sorts of things that could sustain longer voyages. And so even in the 1400s, we see Portuguese explorers going out, trying to find a back door to India and China, and eventually they sail all the way down around Africa, the tip of Africa, and up the other side, and find their way to India and to China, among other places, into Asia. A lot of this is brought on by developments in science and astronomy and those sorts of things that enable people to make these voyages without getting lost or whatever the case may be. And so during this time period, especially when we get into the 1500s, more and more nations have developed sort of this new technology, if you will, and are interested in, well, what else is out there in our world? For a long time, people believed, as you know, that the earth was flat. If we go sailing out that way too far, we're going to fall off the ends of the earth, and nothing good's going to come of that. Well, science, astronomy, other developments beginning to happen. Hey, maybe we're not on a flat earth anymore. maybe this is a round thing that we're on that's sort of spinning through space, and maybe we can sail around it, and maybe there are other things out there. And so we begin to see sort of a change in attitude as various nations begin to hit the seas in order to do their exploring and see what's out there. Now, Spain and Portugal lead the way. Both of these are strong Roman Catholic countries, which will have sort of a bearing on everything. They head all over the place down the African coast, but most significantly, they head across the Atlantic, where they make discoveries in South America, what we would now call South America, Central America, and even into North America. But other nations are getting involved as well, maybe not to the same degree or at the same pace or as early as the Spanish and Portuguese did. But Italians and Dutch and French and English are all beginning to navigate the seas and try to figure this thing out, and where there's some territories that we can explore, not only in terms of national acclaim, financial gain, but in terms of expanding religious influence and Christianity's influence as well. And so that degree of competition is also taking place here when we get into the 1500s. Now, the story probably needs to start with Spain, with Columbus in 1492, as you know well, and that's when Columbus loads up his vessels and begins to head across the Atlantic with his little ships, his little posse on board. They're on their way looking for India, and lo and behold, they find the Dominican Republic, which isn't exactly the same, but it took Columbus a little bit of time to figure that out. So remember that Columbus is being supported by the Spanish king and queen. Their names are Ferdinand and Isabella. And to a great degree, Isabella is really the power behind the couple in many ways. They are devoted Catholics. They are closely connected with the Pope and the Catholic Church. And when Columbus goes out, I mean, Columbus is a good Catholic himself, but brings along a hefty Catholic influence on his voyages, so that if something new is discovered, then immediately it can sort of be claimed not only for Spain, but for the Catholic Church as well. And so as Columbus sets sail aboard his little vessels, not only is he wanting to find a back way to India, but maybe there's some other lands out there that we can claim as well. And wherever we go, there was this expectation that you bring along the Christian faith. There is a desire to Christianize these new lands and the new people that you find and encounter. And when Columbus finds what becomes the Dominican Republic, Hispaniola, he begins to write letters back, and you begin to see more and more ships being loaded up and more people coming. And okay, we've got this, and then we find Puerto Rico, and then we find some of the other islands, and then, oh my goodness, there's this big old landmass over here, and up and down we go, and exploring and all those sorts of things begins to happen. And all the while, Christianity, the Roman Catholic version of Christianity, is being imported into these lands as well. And so certainly by the time you get into the early 1500s, certainly by the 1520s, you've got all sorts of Spanish explorers, Spanish missionaries who are making their way across the Atlantic, who are doing all sorts of exploration work and missionary related work in South America, in Central America, and up into the southern parts of North America as well, or what would become known as those areas. Now, it's probably fair to recognize that the missionary efforts of the time were closely tied with political ambition, with economic drive. Many of these explorers were hoping to find, vast sums of treasure and all these sorts of things to make themselves and to make their name great. Many of them had spent everything they had in order to come over to these areas and do their exploration. They really weren't all that concerned about the people that they found. Not really. I mean, we want to baptize them. We want them to be Christian in name in that sense. But most of the explorers are concerned about land and money and power and those sorts of things. It's the missionary force, it's the monastic missionary force that comes with them who tries to figure out ways of connecting with the people, of connecting the Christian faith within this new environment. But baptisms are often forced. We see that from the records. Treasures are taken, empires are destroyed. The Mayan Empire, the Incan Empire, these South and Central American empires that had no doubt been around for hundreds and hundreds of years quickly are crippled by not a whole lot of Spanish folks who are coming in. A lot of it was disease that the Spaniards brought with them, things that they had immunities to, but the native tribal people were struck down and destroyed by many of these. But in many places, the missionary force tried to establish missionary outposts. They tried to establish little places where converts could come, where they could learn the faith. Many of them, they're trying to teach them Spanish. They're trying to teach them Latin so that they can understand the Catholic Mass and understand the Scripture and those sorts of things. And so these little missionary stations are popping up all over the place. And so we see that this is happening even in places that we would continue to recognize today. If you've ever traveled to the Southwest, the American Southwest, if you go down into sort of the furthest parts of California, into Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, over into Florida, lots of Spanish influence continues to be seen there, and a lot of that is connected to the roots of the early explorers, Spanish explorers, who came to those territories. So, for example, and this is just a few examples, Saint Augustine in Florida, established by an early Spanish presence. And no doubt Augustinians who want to name their little settlement after St. Augustine. You go over a little further into Texas, in a place like San Antonio, the Alamo was originally a missionary outpost for Spanish-speaking missionaries to reach out to the local population. It sort of takes on a different feel to it a little bit later, when the sort of the Texas War for Independence is going on, those sorts of things. But San Antonio, San is a word that we would translate saint, and so Antonio was this particular Antonio was a saint from a particular Italian region. And we go out to San Diego. Those are Spanish explorers in the early 1600s who are naming the territory after after their patron saint. And so we see all of these sorts of influences and missionary stations, outposts being opened up in an attempt to reach out to and evangelize the local native tribal communities that existed in those particular areas. But the Spanish were not alone. The Spanish sort of come at things from the south, if you will, South America, Central America, up through Mexico, up to this American Southwest. French Catholics had come across the Atlantic as well, but they sort of land way further north and work their way from north to south, while Spain is coming and working its way from south to north. And so we know many French Catholics began in Canada, thus the French-speaking parts of Canada, but a number of French monastic groups came and worked to set up little forts and preaching outposts where they could try and minister and evangelize, again, the local tribal communities that they were surrounded by. And so the French began up north where it's much colder, and gradually decided we're going to do some further exploration. And their easiest way to explore was through finding, wow, this huge river that begins way up north that comes to be called the Mississippi. And they began to explore their way down the river, um, opening missionary outposts along the way. Some of them don't survive, but French influence is still felt. Um, we call it Detroit. They would have called it Detroit. Illinois was a major French Catholic area for a period of time. They came on down the river and let's set up something here and we'll name it after the French King Louis. So Saint Louis becomes a part of that, and we go all the way down into Louisiana where Orleans is named after the French city of the same name. You've got Baton Rouge, which is French and its connections. And so we see this French Catholic influence all up and down the Mississippi River, and that's because of these French monastic folks who came, connected with French explorers, and in an attempt to not only win land for the country, but to win converts for the church, we came and explored in all of these ways and tried to establish communities along the way. Most of them, looking back historically now, we see that none of them were terribly vibrant. There was a lot of resistance within the tribal communities to this imported religion that they didn't believe that they needed, and certainly didn't like the way that it was forced upon them in many instances. And so that's just a sort of a taste of some of the early Catholic influence that we see as the church begins to expand beyond its Western European borders. Protestants were also involved in this effort, although it was a little bit different. And Protestants didn't have necessarily the same sort of manpower, the same sort of political connections that Spain and Portugal had at the time. Protestants, even though, for example, they gradually get control of England, that's still a process through the 1500s. And so England will eventually get involved, but it'll look a little bit different than we've seen in terms of Spanish and French influence. Well, one of the ways that the Protestants get involved early on is through what are called trading companies. In significant Protestant areas in Western Europe, the government supported local churches. And church and government oftentimes tried to work together. So the government was trying to go into this new area. They want to do business in this new area. So they open up a company, but then the church comes along to partner with the company because we want to not only expand our worlds economically, but we want to be proactive in trying to reach other parts of the world as well. And so we see that with these early government sponsored trading companies that begin to pop up, especially in Asia, in some other places as well, but Asia was sort of the main place that we see this. Now, the most famous of these, the one that we probably know the most about, is called the Dutch East India Trading Company. Dutch, because it's connected with the Dutch government, Dutch territories at the time, and they are trying to establish contacts, business in the eastern part of India. And so they've sailed some folks all the way around Africa, all the way up to the other side, landed in East India along the coast, and they've tried to establish trading relationships and partnerships and those sorts of things. But the company, we want to send our own Dutch people to India. So we sail them around over to India in order to set up a base of operations. And so we've got to have people who live there. But at least in this day and age, the early 1600s, it's not like we're going to just sort of move out into India and just everybody all live together. That's not going to happen. And so they sort of set up their little Dutch enclave of homes and businesses and those sorts of things. Well, if we're going to set up our little piece of Dutch life in India, one of the things that we need is the church to be present as well. And so the company, working in conjunction with the church, sponsored chaplains to be a part of the Dutch East India Company, who were paid by the government to go and live in India with the Dutch settlers, preaching, doing those sorts of things, tending to spiritual needs, doing weddings, doing funerals, all those sorts of things, sort of on behalf of the Dutch Reformed Church. We didn't have a chance to sort of follow this line of thought when we talked about the Reformation, but Calvin's influence is very heavily felt in Dutch territories, and one of the largest of the Reformed churches, capital R Reformed churches, is the Dutch Reformed Church at this particular time. And so all things Dutch Reformed, we want to take to India to be with our people. We need chaplains and pastors to do that. And so we're going to pay you to go and be involved in this way, and let's take care of our people. Now, some chaplains get over there and they're glad to do their sort of work with the Dutch population, but they also see that around them are thousands and thousands of Indians, folks from India who are worshiping their gods and don't have any clue about Christianity, and they want to be involved, and they try to make some efforts to reach out into local communities. Usually that was not received very well at all. But the Dutch East India Company appreciated those sorts of efforts, and for a period of time, apparently, the company would pay missionaries a bonus for every convert that they brought into the church. Well, if I was clever enough, I would have a wild looking emoji face pop up on the PowerPoint at this point, because this begins to make me a little bit nervous. Get your convert and we'll pay you a bonus. You can see how that would be open to abuse pretty quickly, and how numbers could get juggled and reports could get made that might not be completely accurate so that we can get a bonus. And what does that conversion look like? Well, that's a little hard to tell. So So that becomes sort of a ticklish practice for a period of time that eventually is removed. But it's interesting that the Dutch Reformed Church does want that sort of outreach to be happening. They're just not quite sure how to do it yet. Y'all are welcome to come to our Dutch speaking church. Nobody in India speaks Dutch except the Dutch people, and so the Dutch people typically are not learning the local dialects, and so that sort of makes it difficult to build up any significant community of faith there. And so if you've got some early Protestants who are doing missionary work sort of by way of business and government sponsored entities, England approaches things a little bit differently, especially once Elizabeth settles into her reign as Queen of England in the late 1500s. One of the things that she begins to do is sending out her own sort of group of explorers, heading out, exploring, seeing what we can find. They make their way all over the place, but coming to North America is the easiest route. And so we see early on that, yeah, English explorers are sort of poking around the coast of the United States for a period of time. The first colony comes along in 1607. The colony itself, the land is named in honor of the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, so it's called Virginia. The current king at the time was James, and so the settlement that they establish is called Jamestown. All of that is happening in the year 1607. There's about 100 or so folks who come on this first load. It's mainly men and boys who come. They're trying to figure out what's going on. It's not really safe for a family. So these are sort of worker bees and trying to get a lay of the land and maybe what crops can we plant and what sort of industry might we be able to be involved in. All of those sorts of things are part of the mindset of this early group. Now we know that there wasn't a whole lot of overt religious meaning behind the founding of Jamestown. It was mainly for economic purposes and political purposes. But the Church of England wants to be involved, and so soon after the settlement of Jamestown, the Church of England begins to send clergy over. We want to care for the welfare of our citizens who are settling there, and so folks come and establish some sort of pattern of church life, those sorts of things. It doesn't seem like it's very well attended or very well received, but at least there are some efforts by the Church of England to be involved. Now, a little bit later, things within the English context change significantly when we get to the year 1620. And even if you were a bad student of history growing up, 1620 ought to ring a bell when we start talking about pilgrims, when we start talking about the Mayflower. All of those sorts of ideas begin to come into play here. But this is sort of a different group that's beginning to make an appearance. In 1620, the citizens of England who begin to sail across the Atlantic for the New World, yeah, economics is maybe a part of things, but by and large, these are folks facing religious persecution back home. James the First is cracking down on dissenting groups, those who are not in line with the Church of England. And so we begin to see some of these English separatists. They've moved away from the Church of England. They're facing persecution. Well, we can go to Dutch territories, but there's also this opportunity if we sail west, where there's new land. Maybe we can make a life for ourselves there and practice our faith according to the dictates of our own consciences. And so in 1620 begins a trickle of folks who began braving their way across the Atlantic and settling in the New World. And apparently they were hoping to maybe catch Virginia around Jamestown somewhere, but instead they end up landing a little further north. And thus begins the colony of Plymouth. These are folks, a religious minority, looking to flee religious persecution, who see God at work in the guiding of this adventure. And so they settle in Plymouth and begin to found a little colony. As you may remember, most of them don't survive the first year, but they're writing letters back. And so we begin to see more and more ships and more separatists who make their way to Plymouth. But the Puritans, they didn't want to miss out on a good thing. And so even some Puritans were not well received back at home by James I. And so they begin to come too. They settle just down the road from Plymouth in a little colony that will become known as Massachusetts Bay. The Puritans come in and establish this, what they believe is a sort of a God-ordained society. We now have the opportunity to set up and run the church the way that we believe it's supposed to be run, getting rid of those Catholic elements that we don't want anymore. So you got the Puritans over here and the separatists over here trying to live and figure out how to plant crops and do all those sorts of things and to establish their religious communities. And it's just a matter of time. England, by this point, is full of various other religious dissidents, religious minorities, Baptists and Quakers and all sorts of other folks, very small groups, too many to mention, who decide, hey, we want to get in on this too. And so they begin setting sail. And it adds to this interesting mix that we have very early on in the North American colonies. And I guess the last thing that we'll mention here is, as they're coming and settling and landing, there are native North American folks living here. Various tribes from Virginia all the way up to Massachusetts Bay, where folks are landing and trying to establish colonies. And for the most part, there's not a lot of goodwill missionary spirit among the early Puritans and separatists. For the most part, they just want to drive the natives off the land that they want to have and to settle. And for the most part, they are able to do that. There's only a few folks who come along who are like, now this is an opportunity for us to reach out and to build some relationships and to try to evangelize. But at least in the early days, as these settlements are just beginning, those voices are pretty few and far between. Most folks are more than happy to drive the natives off the land, to kill them if need be for our own protection, rather than a real missionary sort of endeavor to learn languages and reach out and translate the Bible, those sorts of things. A few of those things are happening, but not very much during this time. And so we sort of get to this point today where, okay, Christianity, at least as we have followed it to a great degree this semester, we've sort of followed the Western direction of things. We know that there's a church in the East out of Constantinople and later out of Moscow, an Eastern Orthodox tradition that is moving in that direction. We've tended to follow the Western direction, the Roman Catholic Church, the Protestant Reformation, And for a long time, this was sort of the religion of Western Europe. Was it ever going to grow and expand beyond that? Well, yes. And so here it comes by way of explorers and missionaries and those sorts of things, making their way all the way to India, into China, as we'll see eventually, but also into South America and Central America and North America, and Spanish and French and English are beginning to come and to try to settle territories, to evangelize people, to claim land for the crown back home, and to gain converts for the church that they are supporting as well. So this sort of sets the stage for us, and we'll build on this and move forward. Next time, we'll probably fast forward through the 1600s pretty quickly. Now, maybe talk a little bit about the experience going on in North America, but pretty quickly we'll find our way into the 1700s and the development of pietism and new religious ideas and revivals, and John Wesley and some of those sorts of things are coming. If you'll hang on just a few more days, I'll get you there. All right. Take care. See you soon.